A storm is coming. But this isn't a storm of wind and rain. It's a storm of defiance. A storm that shakes the old order, rattles the power corridors of Paris, London, and Washington, and sends a message across the continent. Africa will no longer kneel. At the heart of this storm stands one man, a soldier, a leader, a revolutionary. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. February 2024. A moment that will be etched in history. Traoré expels French troops from Burkina Faso, a move so bold, so unprecedented, that it sends shockwaves through the Western world. To some, he is a hero reclaiming his country's destiny. To others, he is a dangerous threat to the global order. But one thing is certain, he does not back down.
The next day, French President Emmanuel Macron said he was awaiting clarifications from transitional President Ibrahim Traoré. But on Monday, government spokesman Rimtalba Jean-Emmanuel Ouedraogo said, "We don't see how to be more clear than this."
Au stade actuel, nous ne voyons pas.
The West thought this was temporary, a burst of rebellion that would fade under pressure. But Traoré had other plans. He wasn't just rejecting France, he was rewriting the playbook. He turned east, and when he did, the world held its breath. Now, Russian special forces land on Burkina Faso soil. Venezuelan intelligence moves in. Cuban military advisors stand ready. The balance of power is shifting, and France can do nothing but watch. This is more than just a military shift. This is a warning shot to the West. The era of control is ending. And Captain Traoré? He's just getting started. But how did we get here? And more importantly, what happens next? Let's find out. The world thought it had seen this story before. An African leader challenging the West, standing tall for a moment, only to be dragged down by pressure, sanctions, or worse. But this time, something is different. The script is changing. The West is no longer the only player on the board. The balance of power is shifting, and Burkina Faso is at the center of it. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré expelled French troops from Burkina Faso, it wasn't just about removing foreign boots from the ground. It was about severing a chain that had kept the country locked into an arrangement where France dictated security, dictated resources, dictated the future. For decades, Burkina Faso was expected to follow orders. But suddenly, that control was gone, and the question became, what happens next? For the West, the expectation was simple: isolation. A leader like Traoré, young and daring, should have found himself alone, facing diplomatic pressure, military threats, and economic retaliation. That's the way it always worked. Remove the West, and you remove the safety net. Cut off French influence, and the so-called protector turns into a punisher, ensuring no alternatives exist. But Traoré was not walking into the abyss. He was stepping into something entirely new. Within weeks of rejecting France, new forces began arriving. Forces with no history of colonizing Africa, no legacy of plundering its wealth, and no intention of keeping it subservient. Russia, Venezuela, Cuba. Their presence signaled a reality that France had refused to acknowledge. The world had changed, and so had Africa's choices. Russia's involvement was the most striking. While the West cried influence, Moscow played by a different set of rules. The arrival of Russian special forces was not an occupation. It was a partnership. These weren't just military personnel. They were counterinsurgency experts, strategists, and battlefield specialists. They weren't here to dictate. They were here to train, to arm, to strengthen. Burkina Faso was not being absorbed into a new empire. It was being equipped to stand on its own. Venezuela's role was unexpected to many, but not to those paying attention. A country that had itself been targeted by Western sanctions, Caracas understood what it meant to resist. Their intelligence specialists knew how to counter external sabotage, how to build networks outside of Western control, and how to survive when every move was being watched and every step was being undermined. If the West wanted to isolate Traoré, Venezuela had the blueprint to break that isolation. And then there was Cuba, a country that had, for decades, defied American pressure, outmaneuvering embargoes, resisting coups, and building alliances in places the U.S. wanted abandoned. Cuban advisors didn't just bring military expertise, They brought experience in self-sufficiency, resilience, and survival in a world determined to make independent nations fail. For Burkina Faso, this was no longer just about replacing one military force with another. It was about something deeper: sovereignty, true sovereignty. The kind that doesn't depend on former colonial rulers to decide what security should look like. The kind that builds military strength not as an extension of foreign interests, but as a tool of national defense. The kind that turns alliances into leverage, not chains. The West's reaction was predictable: denouncement, condemnation, panic. France saw its influence slipping away. The US whispered of concerns over stability. But beneath the surface, something far more unsettling was happening. A precedent was being set. An African nation had expelled Western forces and not collapsed. It had cut ties with Europe's military and not fallen into chaos. Instead, it was forging new paths, testing new relationships, and proving that a future without Western oversight was not only possible, it was unfolding in real time. The power shift wasn't just military, it was psychological. It was the dismantling of an old belief that Africa could not stand on its own without Western supervision. That security, stability, and sovereignty were things to be given, not claimed. But Traoré had already claimed them. The new forces in Burkina Faso were not the beginning of dependence, but the end of it. With each arriving specialist, with each new alliance, the message became clearer. The days of Western monopoly in Africa were over. And if Burkina Faso could do it, who would be next? If Burkina Faso could reject Western control and survive, why couldn't Mali? Why couldn't Niger? Why couldn't the entire Sahel? The old world order depended on African nations believing they were powerless. Now, that illusion was fading. In Paris, officials scrambled for damage control. There were urgent meetings, frantic calls, and demands for explanations. France had already lost Mali. It had been kicked out of the Central African Republic. Now Burkina Faso? The empire was slipping, and no one seemed able to stop it. In Washington, analysts whispered about Russian influence, about strategic threats, and security risks. But deep down, they knew this was not just about geopolitics. This was about a global shift, one where African nations no longer asked for permission. This was the moment the West had feared for years, a moment where African countries realized they had choices, where the script of dependency was being rewritten, where military, economic, and diplomatic power was no longer monopolized by the former colonial masters. And so, the West did what it always does when losing control. It turned to propaganda. The media machine kicked into overdrive. Reports flooded in, warning of Russian mercenaries destabilizing the region. Articles framed Traoré's alliances as reckless, dangerous, and a threat to security. There were whispers of coups, of instability, of Burkina Faso heading toward chaos. But the West playbook was old, predictable, and worst of all, ineffective, because something fundamental had changed. Traoré wasn't just resisting Western influence, he was winning. The world could see it. The people of Burkina Faso could feel it. And across Africa, leaders were watching. For years, the West had controlled the narrative. The idea that African nations were too weak, too divided, and too inexperienced to govern themselves was repeated so often that even some Africans believed it. But Traoré had shattered that illusion.
We work many different ways, but perhaps the most common is that we will identify a third world country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. However, the money never goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our own corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, highways, industrial parks, things that benefit a few rich people in that country, as well as our own corporations, but do not help the majority of the people at all. And yet the whole country, is left holding a huge debt. And it's such a huge debt they can't possibly repay it. So at some point, the economic hitmen go back and say, you owe us a lot of money, you can't repay your debts, so give us a pound of flesh. When I failed to bring them around, to get them to accept these loans, to get them to put their countries into servitude, then I knew that standing right behind me were what we call the jackals. And these are people who overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. And both Jaime Roldos of Ecuador and Omar Torrijos of Panama were assassinated by CIA-sponsored jackals because I failed to corrupt them.
Burkina Faso was not collapsing without France. It was growing. And if the West had no real control over Burkina Faso anymore, then what did it have left? The panic was no longer just about military bases. It was about the loss of an empire. But now the question is, can Burkina Faso survive without the West? Is Russian support enough? Power isn't just about soldiers, it's about money. And if the West couldn't control Burkina Faso through military bases, it had another weapon: economic strangulation. For decades, France's dominance over West Africa wasn't just about troops on the ground. It was about a financial system designed to keep its former colonies dependent. The CFA franc is a currency controlled by Paris, trade routes that always led back to Europe, foreign aid that looked like generosity but functioned like a leash, tightening whenever a leader stepped out of line. Burkina Faso had just taken a bold step, cutting off the military ties that kept France in control. But could it survive without the economic safety net the West had woven around it? Western strategists believed the answer was no. They had seen this before. Leaders who challenged France found their economies squeezed, investment withdrawn, trade cut off, aid frozen. The script was familiar. First came the military expulsion, then the financial retaliation, then the inevitable collapse. That was how the system worked. Except this time, something different happened. Burkina Faso didn't crumble. It pivoted. It turned to new trade routes, new financial partners, and new models of economic survival. Traoré had been preparing for this moment, and when the West tried to pull the plug, he had already found a new power source. Russia stepped in with investment. Yes, not just military, but also with investments. Venezuela brought energy partnerships. China, always watching, saw an opportunity, and with a single move, opened the door to alternative banking systems, trade agreements, and infrastructure funding that bypassed Western oversight. The message was clear. Burkina Faso didn't need the West's permission to thrive. But breaking free from an economic empire is not just about replacing one partner with another. It's about changing the rules of the game, and that's exactly what Traoré set out to do. First, he attacked the heart of Western control, the CFA franc. This colonial-era currency had kept Burkina Faso, and much of West Africa, under economic subjugation for years. The moment France lost military influence, it clung to the financial chains. But Traoré was already looking beyond it. Plans to shift towards a new monetary system, independent of Paris, were quietly moving forward. The end of the CFA franc in Burkina Faso would mark the final break from French control, and France knew it. Second, Traoré understood that food was power. Dependency on Western aid made Burkina Faso vulnerable, so he turned his focus to agricultural self-sufficiency. Investments in rice production surged. Local industries, long neglected under foreign-controlled trade policies, were being revived. Burkina Faso was no longer going to beg for food, it was going to produce it. And third, energy independence became a priority. For too long, Burkina Faso relied on French-backed energy imports, but Venezuela, one of the world's largest oil-rich nations, offered a new path. Fuel deals that didn't require Western approval, energy supplies that couldn't be shut off at a moment's notice. The reaction from Paris was immediate. Sanctions were whispered about. Threats of economic repercussions grew louder. French corporations, deeply embedded in Burkina Faso's economy, began pulling back. But the damage wasn't what they expected. The country didn't collapse. It adapted. And this terrified the West. Because Burkina Faso wasn't just cutting ties, it was proving something dangerous. It was proving that a nation could reject Western financial systems and still survive, that a country could stand against economic blackmail and build a new foundation. For the first time in modern history, Burkina Faso wasn't just a pawn in the global economy, it was trying to become a player. And the rest of Africa was watching. But history has a pattern. When an African leader dares to challenge Western control, when they push too far, cut too many ties, and refuse to bow, one outcome repeats itself again and again: a coup. It happened to Thomas Sankara in 1987. It happened to Patrice Lumumba in 1961. It happened to Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. Each time, the formula was the same: destabilize, isolate, overthrow. Now, all eyes are on Burkina Faso. For months, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has defied the odds. He has expelled French troops. He has built military alliances outside of Western control. He has broken the economic chains that kept Burkina Faso dependent. And most dangerously, he has exposed the system, showing other African nations that independence is not just an idea, but a real possibility. But with each step forward, the risk grows. Because the West does not simply accept defeat. When sanctions, propaganda, and intelligence wars fail, there is only one strategy left: regime change. And Traoré knows it. It starts with division. The most effective coups are not led by foreign invaders. They are carried out by insiders, military officers, government officials, and even trusted allies who have been compromised. The West doesn't need to launch direct attacks. It just needs to find the right people, offer the right deals, and let the betrayal unfold from within. The second step is chaos. Burkina Faso is already facing an insurgency crisis, one that was conveniently fueled over the years by Western weapons mysteriously ending up in the hands of insurgents. If the country can be pushed into deeper instability, if the security situation deteriorates, then suddenly, calls for a leadership change become necessary. The narrative shifts. Traoré, once seen as the man restoring order, is painted as a failure. A solution is proposed, one that just happens to involve removing him from power. And finally, there is the final blow. A well-planned military coup, a sudden and violent transition of power. Within hours, a new leader is declared. A leader who promises stability. A leader who pledges to restore international cooperation. A leader whose first move is to invite back the same Western forces that had just been expelled. This is the cycle that has been repeated across Africa for decades. And now, the West is waiting to see if Burkina Faso will be the next to fall. But remember, Traoré is young, but he is not naive. He knows the pattern. He has studied the past. And he is not waiting to become the next statistic. His first move has been to secure absolute loyalty within his military. Unlike previous leaders who assumed their inner circle was safe, Traoré has actively reshuffled key military positions, placing only the most trusted officers in critical roles. He has removed figures suspected of outside influence. He has built a network of direct command that does not rely on Western-trained officers who could be flipped at a moment's notice. Second, he has taken control of Burkina Faso's security operations. Western intelligence agencies thrive on secrecy, on operating within foreign governments without detection. But Traoré has made it clear: there will be no shadow actors running the country from behind closed doors. Intelligence operations have been centralized. Surveillance on potential traitors has increased. The usual coup suspects, politicians with too many Western connections, and military officers with foreign training are being watched closely. And most importantly, Traoré is rallying the people. No coup succeeds without public support, and this is where he holds an advantage. Unlike past leaders who were quietly overthrown with little resistance, Traoré has made himself a symbol of the people's fight for sovereignty. If an attempt is made to remove him, it will not be a quiet transition. It will spark a nationwide uprising. And the West knows that a coup that turns into a civil conflict is far riskier than they would like. So Burkina Faso is standing at a crossroads. The next months will determine whether Traoré succeeds in reshaping the country's future, or if he falls into the same trap that has claimed so many before him. But one thing is clear: this is no longer just about Burkina Faso. This is about a continent waking up. From Mali to Niger to Guinea, African nations are watching. If Traoré can break the cycle, if he can survive without bending to the coup trap, then the rest of Africa will have its proof. Independence is not just a dream, it is a reality waiting to be claimed. And for the West, that is the greatest threat of all. The battle is not over. It has only just begun. One lesson this teaches us is that this is what happens when you leave the West and build new alliances with countries like Russia. But no matter how aggressive the West becomes, Traoré is ready to face it all. Do you think West can make Traoré bow? With new alliances, does Burkina Faso need anyone? Let us know in the comments section. Why does the West think they can still control African nations? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.